was able to give you a little bit of a download of what's going on here on Maui. Do you have some advice for the residents of Maui and what they need to consider in all of this?
Well, my advice is to do what it appears is already being done, and that's to keep fighting for personal rights, keep fighting for public health, fighting for the rights of our children, fighting for the rights of the environment. Much of what the agrochemical industry is about is making money, not feeding the world. 20% of the world dies of starvation because they don't have access to staples, and our biggest crop in the U.S. we eat directly less than 2% of. That's corn. So fighting for public health, and don't assume that somebody else is looking out for you.
Well, aren't there regulatory agencies that are supposed to be looking out for it?
There are regulatory agencies. I believe that those regulatory agencies, such as the FDA and the EPA, have been compromised. They are political entities run by political appointees, the EPA, for example. And I believe that even when the science is there, the EPA itself has even said that they put a price tag on human health and on human life, and they weigh that against the cost of getting rid of a chemical from the environment.
Well, doesn't the EPA do its own testing? Is there anything independent that they do?
There are EPA scientists that do testing of chemicals for sure. In the case of atrazine, for example, 3 of the most damning and most significant findings with atrazine are that it, when pregnant rats are exposed, it causes abortion. It also causes mammary or breast abnormalities in female fetuses that are exposed in utero, and it causes prostate disease in male pups that are exposed in utero. 3 independent EPA laboratories produce that science, and yet that science is not being used to regulate the chemical properly, in my opinion.
And why do you think that is?
Politics and economics. I think the EPA and I think all the scientists involved, I'll show some data now from the company, that they know exactly what these chemicals do, but now atrazine, for example, being used on corn is all tied up in the ethanol industry and the renewable fuels industry and all those, you know, the lobbyists and the politics and economics around those issues.
How did this get so out of control?
I think part of it is history. So when most of these chemicals, when most of the 80,000 chemicals, certainly most of the pesticides that we use came on the market, there was no EPA. So now we've got chemicals out there that were never regulated, that were never tested. They were tested, for example, in World War II and then just brought here for agricultural purposes. Now the EPA is doing its best to try to catch up and regulate chemicals that are already out there that we've already been exposed to for lifetime already.
So, for instance, we have a major agrochemical company here on Maui that presented to the county a whole stack of 2,000 reports. Is that stuff current, and is that stuff accurate? Has anybody verified that stuff?
Depends on what you call a report. I mean, for example, Syngenta likes to say that atrazine has been shown to be safe in over 7,000 studies. Well, those studies aren't available to you or me. They aren't available to the public. They haven't been peer reviewed, so they haven't been vetted in that way. These are sometimes reports of just measurements, or who knows what it is they've tested. But certainly of the published literature that's out there, one, there's not that much out there on many of the chemicals that we're talking about, atrazine being one of the exceptions. And 2, what's out there is the EPA is obliged to weight more heavily these industry studies, and they more or less collaborate with industry on these studies to make the regulatory decisions.
So those regulatory decisions essentially favor the agrochemical companies?
Absolutely. They favor the chemical companies.
And what watchdog agencies are there?
Well, that's a good question. I wish I knew the answer to that. Especially in this climate where research funding for independent research is drying up and the chemical industry has unlimited resources to fund study after study after study, which are oftentimes poorly conducted studies, and sometimes in the case of atrazine, it's even in their best interest to submit poor studies, because then the EPA says, oh, all these studies are done really poorly, and so we can't evaluate the compound. Remember, I was funded, I worked with these guys at Syngenta, so I know that was one of their tactics, is to present study after study after study that's inadequate, and they know that it's inadequate, but it just muddies the water. And then what people hear as public is that, oh, all these studies were flawed, and so we can't tell anything. In fact, that's part of their plan.
What other backhanded techniques do they have that we should be paying attention to?
Well, in my own case, for example, they specifically set out to discredit me. They specifically hired scientists to, quote, show that they could not repeat my studies, and then they went after me personally. They went after me when they couldn't prove my science wrong. After spending, probably hundreds of thousands, probably millions of dollars, then they went after me with personal attacks.
Was that effective?
No, that was not a. Where I come from, you don't back down from a fight. If anything, it made their situation more difficult. If anything, it taught me, as I've said before, I now know I've been tested by the best. I have no fear of the rest. Because they spent millions of dollars trying to discredit me, you'll see in some of their handwritten notes, trying to link me to a scandal so that, the environmental groups wouldn't want to be associated with me, and they failed. I mean, they went through my life, they went through my science, they went through my data, and they failed. So I'm very confident now in both the science and the work and in the way that I live my life and the choices that I've made.
Is there what they call disinformation out there?
Oh, absolutely. One of the tactics is you put information out there and you flood people with information. You tell people that, they'll say things like, I refuse to share my data. So, they're trying to discredit me. In fact, that's just not true. My data or science was originally conducted under the auspices and under the guidance and directly watched by Syngenta. They received all of my raw data, all of my information. In my subsequent studies, the EPA was in my laboratory, observing everything we did, collecting the data, reanalyzing the data. So the original data were available, but when people hear that, and they think it's from a reputable source, when people hear that my work couldn't be replicated, which is absolutely not true. There are dozens of laboratories around the world that I've collaborated with now and published with now that produce similar data independent of my work. The only scientists who found that atrazine doesn't cause problems in animals are the scientists that they've funded.
There seem to be a collection of independent people who say that they're independent scientists that seem to justify everything that's GMO and criticize everything that's anti-GMO. Do you think some of these people are professionals?
Are they professionals? It depends on your definition of professional. They're professional somethings.
Are they being paid for their opinion to express their? Tell me that back.
So it's a known fact that, for example, in the case of atrazine, Syngenta paid scientists. They paid people to write papers. They paid pundits to put their names on ideas and opinions, and they paid people to go after me. That's a fact. So we have those documents showing that they paid people like Steve Malloy, they paid people like Alex Avery, they paid scientists like Klaus Werner and James Carr to say that they couldn't replicate my work. Those are words that were put into people's mouths and purchased.
And so here on Maui, we have this local initiative, and the local initiative is receiving criticism. Do you think that perhaps some of that criticism is manufactured and people are paid to criticize the movement?
Oh, absolutely. The industry will pay people. They'll have people come to talks, for example. They'll probably have somebody here tonight. They'll pay people to publish op-ed pieces in local newspapers, and this is one of their tactics to try to really dishearten people and get people to back down and to provide misinformation from those people who aren't adequately informed.
We have, an opportunity to put an initiative on the ballot. The companies are at the same time lobbying to take away our right to do that. They want to legislate and preempt the community from being able to make rules about what happens here in the community. Have you seen that happen elsewhere and in other ways? That
doesn't surprise me. I mean, I've been, for example, where I've testified in Minnesota where the company will pay busloads of people to come in and sit in on the legislative hearings to influence the local Congress people, to make them think that most people don't want a safer environment, for example, to make them think that people really want to use chemicals that they know are harming the environment and harming themselves and their families.
So do you think people in this community would do well to be skeptical of people that are promoting the GMOs and criticizing the alternatives?
I would say always be skeptical. I'm a scientist. I'm skeptical of myself. I look at my data and go, that can't be true, let's repeat it. My students tell me something and I go, show me the data, show it to me again. Don't believe me either. Go back, dig out the data and decide for yourself. Don't believe in anything, but follow the data.
Well, most people aren't scientists, and they're not going to have the ability to do that. They have to take somebody's word for it. The general public just, at some point just takes people's word for it.
Well, I think in that regard, and that's not to say that, I think you have to look at the source. And I think if you know somebody has a financial interest, a conflict of interest, then I think you have to question them more critically.
Some of what happens here on Maui and in Maui County is, experimentation. We're a a petri dish, because we've got 4 growing seasons, and they're doing unique work in growing seed corn, for instance, that they distribute around the world. Do you think that Hawaii and Maui County has some unique set of circumstances that makes it at greater risk than the rest of the country?
I think Hawaii is at greater risk for a number of reasons. One is these are new pesticides, new GMOs. These are things that have not been tested, that are being released into the environment for the first time. It's being released in a place that you can do it, I understand, 4 times per year, so you're getting hit harder that way. It's being released in an environment that's very fragile, that's very unique. A lot of endemic species, endemic ecosystems, limited fresh water, limited topsoil, and I think it's an absolute disaster. What I'm hearing about what's going on here in Hawaii and on all of the Hawaiian Islands.
Do you think that they chose to do this work here in part because if something bad happens, they've got a chance in hell of containing it?
I think it's a possibility that they're thinking there's a chance of containing it. I think also there seemed to be a way to go around the Clean Water Act, I was told. And I think, again, it's also a unique environment with many growing seasons where they can continue to do their research year-round.
And is there, in light of that, are there particular precautionary measures that should be taken here? That it's reasonable to take? And what I'd like to try and get at is the precautionary principle. At what point does the precautionary principle trigger in here in Hawaii?
I think the precautionary principle should be applied everywhere. I apply it in my house. You know, if I'm going to bring something home to my wife and my daughter and my son, and there's a possibility there's a risk to them, to their health, to their well-being, then I think we should have the right to say, no, we don't want that here. So not just in Hawaii. Again, I think Hawaii might be unique because of the fragile ecosystems and because of the potential for long-term permanent damage. But I think the precaution principle should be applied everywhere. Everywhere there's people, everywhere there's animals, everywhere there's an environment that we care about, globally.
Is there a difference in the risks related to the growing of GMO entities and the pesticides that are associated with such practices?
Well, I'll tell you my issue with GMOs. My issue with GMOs are not with GMO directly. My issue with GMO is the following. 90% of the seed that we grow are owned by 6 chemical companies. They're owned by 6 chemical companies that are generating GMO products. There's an inherent conflict of interest. So the original promise of GMO was that we were going to have BT corn and we were going to stop using pesticides because the corn was going to make its own pesticide, for example. And it's just the opposite now. Now we're engineering corn and cotton and soy so that it requires pesticides, so it requires more pesticide, because that's what's in the best interest of the chemical companies that own the seeds. That's my biggest problem with GMO right now.
Is the United States isolating itself from the rest of the global economy because of this course?
The U.S. has a big impact, and the U.S. has the potential to do damage far beyond its own borders. So, for example, you'll often hear, I just did interviews in Canada, and you'll hear the Canadian government will say, well, the U.S. EPA approved it, or you'll hear the Australian government say, well, the U.S. EPA approved it. So the U.S. has the potential to do damage around the world because of the policy and because of the poor decisions that it's making, not just with atrazine, but with other agricultural practices as well.
The agrochemical companies, maintain staunchly that they are for farmers and that anybody that is against GMO is against farmers. What do you think?
I think so. Anybody who's against GMO or against farmers, and farmers are for GMO. I think the many cases I've seen of farmers who, for example, have been sued because GMO seed was found on their property or because GMO pollen blew onto their property, I think those farmers would disagree. I think the company has the money to find the farmers who would say that, but I don't know in general if you can make that statement.
Chemical cocktails. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we seem to be experiencing here in Maui County, there's some voluntary disclosure practices that have been adopted, and they simply tell us how much they put on and where they put it on, that we get a gross figure at the end of the year. But they don't tell us in what combinations. We don't know at what time they they did it. What's the risk inherent in that?
Well, we've done some studies, and so have others, that when you get a mixture of pesticides together, you get effects, you get impacts that aren't predictable by looking at the individual compounds. We've shown that, others have shown that, and so it's a dangerous matter, and it's one that I think needs to be addressed. I think it's one that there needs to be reporting, and I think people have a right to know in their communities what chemicals have been applied and when they were applied and in what combination.
And the testing that they do, this is backing up a step, the testing that they do is isolated compounds. Could you speak to the difference of what they test for and what actually happens in the field?
I mean, there's some academic scientists that are testing chemical mixtures, pesticide mixtures, as well as fertilizers mixed in, but there's no systematic approach by the EPA or by anybody that I know of to look at mixtures, and on top of that to evaluate and assess mixture effects in the wild, or to even, it's almost an impossible task, one would argue, is how do you regulate a group of chemicals, especially when you might have farmers side by side that are applying different sets of chemicals. So it'd be like telling one farmer it's okay to use atrazine and metolachlor, and then saying, but it's not okay to use, metolachlor and chlorpyrifos, but then the two farmers side by side are using them and they all get mixed in together. So how do you regulate that? It's very difficult. It's very difficult to study. It's also very difficult to regulate.
Well, they did it with secondhand smoke and cigarettes. Sure. I mean, there's 500 compounds.
Yeah, but we're talking 80,000 chemicals. That's a huge, and then even once if it were possible to look at every combination for even chemicals that's used on, let's say, 1 square mile, then how do you pick out which chemicals were the bad combinations? Was it the full mixture? Was it 2 chemicals in particular? Was it one mixed with this but not the other? It's very difficult. So I'm not arguing it's an easy thing to do. I think it's difficult to study. It's also difficult to evaluate, and it's difficult to regulate.
Well, so that's if we push for that, are we being unreasonable?
I don't think so. I think we have a right for environmental health, for public health, for our future. I think we have a right to push to know these things. For that matter, it's the food that you get. We have a right to know what's been applied to it.
In your experience, what gets sprayed in fields, does that leach into communities around the fields?
Oh, absolutely. So there's direct drift when you spray, right? So there's direct drift. But in the case of atrazine, for example, it can go up on dust and travel 1,000 miles and come down in rainwater. That's been shown. It's been shown in Europe. It's been shown here. So even if you were, for example, working on an organic farm, if you're surrounded by farmers in that community that aren't organic or that are using pesticides, then you're still at risk.
How do we get out of this mess?
It's difficult. I don't know that saying a complete ban on pesticides, or for example, is the way to go. But I think certainly with pesticides like atrazine and a few others, where we know that they cause harm to the environment, that there's a risk to public health, we start there and then we keep going. And again, I think atrazine is a poster child for what needs to be done. And we keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and we set a precedent.
And locally, local initiatives, is it worth pursuing?
That's the start. Grassroots and local. Keep moving forward and building momentum until we get bigger movements. I think that's the only way it's going to happen. I have no confidence in the EPA and no faith that the EPA is going to do it. And we have to take every avenue. That has to be litigation. It has to be pushing our representatives for legislation. And that also means pushing the EPA towards regulation. We have to hit them at all angles.
There are those who say that this is just ultimately going to end with the federal government stepping in and saying that Hawaii is a national security requirement, that the agrochemical companies, for national security purposes, need to be able to do what they're doing. And that we will become a recognized sacrifice zone.
That'd be unfortunate.
You think that something
but
like
it wouldn't
that
surprise me.
Right? You think that there is a scenario where that could happen?
Nothing surprises me. I've seen a statement from a spokesperson to the EPA that, in fact, I'll show the quote in my talk, that there's a price, that we put a price on shortened lives, et cetera, and we weigh that against the cost of removing the chemicals. So there's a price tag on all of our heads. And one of my big issues is we don't all have the same price tag. So oftentimes low income or minority people or maybe Hawaiians, certain states have a lower price tag on their head, and I think that's unfortunate, and I also think that goes against what this very country was founded on. I think it's unpatriotic.
I think that's an excellent place to leave it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your work.